The research team arrived at the abandoned military camp as the sun dipped below the tree line. The base, hidden deep in the forest, had long been overrun by nature. Elena, Sergei, Pavel and Katya were drawn to the site by rumors of Cold War experiments. The air was heavy, and silence pressed down like a weight. "This place feels wrong," Katya murmured as they passed a rusted sign. "Quarantine zone, restricted access." Sergei waved her off. "Just an old base, let's focus." The camp looked frozen in time. Beds were still made in the barracks, boots lined up neatly, but no personal items, no photos, no letters, remained. The emptiness felt staged, unnatural. In a storage room, Elena found a stack of medical files, each stamped contaminated. They described experiments on soldiers exposed to something called Agent V, a substance that caused paranoia, physical mutations, and violent behavior. "They were using their own soldiers," Elena said, her voice shaking, "and they failed." Nearby, Pavel powered up a generator, its dim light flickering across a chained metal door marked with biohazard symbols. A key hung nearby, as if daring them to use it. "Let's leave it," Katya urged. "This isn't our business." But Sergei grabbed the key. "We came for answers." The group hesitated before following him into a corridor beyond the door. The walls were streaked with dark stains, the air thick and acrid. Observation windows lined the hall, each overlooking chambers with overturned beds, restraints, and shattered glass vials. One room bore deep claw marks on its walls. A clipboard on the floor read, "Subject 14, extreme aggression, termination recommended." "What were they keeping here?" Pavel whispered. A metallic clang echoed down the hall. The team froze. Sergei shone his flashlight toward the noise, catching the flicker of a shadow. "Probably just an animal," he muttered unconvincingly. They pressed on, nerves fraying with each step. At the corridor's end, they entered a larger chamber filled with rows of empty containment pods. Some were shattered, others sealed. The air felt alive, buzzing faintly. "This must be where they kept the subjects," Elena said. "But where are they now?" A guttural growl answered her. Flashlight beams converged on a figure hunched in the corner. It was vaguely human, but its elongated limbs and mottled skin betrayed otherwise. Its yellow, reflective eyes locked onto them. "Run!" Sergei whispered. The creature lunged. Pavel screamed as it slammed into him, claws tearing. Elena and Katya bolted, while Sergei grabbed a metal pipe, swinging wildly to buy them time. The women reached the main barracks and slammed the biohazard door shut. Elena fumbled to lock the chains, her hands trembling. "Where's Sergei?" Katya asked, panic in her voice. The growls and slams on the door answered. The hinges buckled as the creature rammed against it, its roars echoing through the building. Finally, the door held, but barely. "We have to go," Elena said, pulling Katya toward the forest. They ran until the camp disappeared behind them, the growls fading into the distance. Only when they stopped to catch their breath did Katya whisper, "Do you think it'll follow?" Elena shook her head, unsure. The creature had been locked away for a reason, and now it was free. Days later, they returned with reinforcements. The camp was empty. The biohazard door hung open, its chains shattered. Of Sergei and Pavel, there was no sign, but fresh claw marks gouged into the concrete told them all they needed to know. The abandoned military camp appeared on the team's radar during a routine satellite scan. Hidden deep within the forest, the base seemed untouched for decades. Emily, Jack, Mike, and Sarah, a group of researchers specializing in Cold War relics, set out to investigate. As they approached the camp, the silence grew oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The gate hung ajar, rusted and overgrown. Inside, rows of barracks stretched into the distance. "Looks like the soldiers just walked out," Mike said, peering through his binoculars. Sarah frowned. "But why leave it so intact?" The barracks loomed ahead, eerily pristine. They entered the first one, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. Rows of beds lined the walls, their sheets still neatly tucked. Lockers stood open, revealing folded uniforms and boots polished to a shine. Everything seemed staged, as if waiting for soldiers who would never return. "No personal belongings," Emily murmured, running her hand along a dusty locker. "No photos, no letters. It's like no one ever lived here." As they moved deeper into the barracks, Sarah stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" The group froze. A faint clicking sound echoed from the far end of the room. Jack motioned for them to stay quiet and stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The clicking grew louder, almost rhythmic. He reached the end of the barracks and found a small tape recorder sitting on a desk, its reels spinning slowly. "What's on it?" Mike asked, joining Jack. Jack pressed play, and the tape hissed to life. A man's voice, trembling with fear, began to speak. "They're watching us. Every night they come closer. We hear them moving, but we can't see them. We can't leave the barracks. If we do, they'll take us too." The tape clicked off. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah shivered. "Who's they? What happened to these soldiers?" Emily picked up the tape recorder. "This wasn't an accident. Someone wanted us to find this." The team moved to the next barracks, each building revealing the same unsettling pattern. Pristine beds, neatly arranged uniforms, and an absence of anything personal. In one room, they found notebooks filled with scribbled messages. "Don't trust the woods." "They're always watching." "We're not alone." Night fell quickly, the darkness swallowing the camp. The team decided to set up a base in the command building, its reinforced walls offering a false sense of security. They gathered around a lantern, reviewing their findings. "These men weren't just soldiers," Emily said. "They were guarding something, or being guarded themselves." A sudden thud outside made everyone jump. Jack grabbed his flashlight and opened the door. The beam revealed nothing but empty barracks and swaying trees. "Probably an animal," he said, though his voice wavered. Hours later, they heard it again. This time, it wasn't a thud, but a low, guttural growl. The sound echoed from the direction of the barracks. Mike swore under his breath, "I'm not going out there!" But Jack was already moving, flashlight in hand. "Stay here," he ordered. Emily couldn't let him go alone. "I'm coming with you." The two crept toward the barracks, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The growl grew louder, joined by a faint shuffling sound. As they neared the building, they saw a figure standing in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette hunched unnaturally. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his flashlight illuminating the figure. It turned slowly, revealing a face that was almost human but distorted, its eyes sunken, its skin pale and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. The creature hissed, retreating into the barracks with unnatural speed. "Back to the command building," Jack whispered, his voice tight with fear. They sprinted back, slamming the door behind them. Sarah and Mike stared at them, wide-eyed. "What was it?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Jack said, "but it's not human." The growls grew louder, now accompanied by scratching at the walls. The sound seemed to come from every direction. Emily's mind raced. "It's the soldiers," she said, "or what's left of them. They didn't leave. They changed." The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence. The team held their breath, the tension suffocating. Then the lantern flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When the light returned, Mike was gone. His chair lay overturned, his belongings scattered on the floor. A trail of blood led to the door. "We have to leave," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jack nodded, grabbing the remaining gear. The team bolted for the gate, the growls and shuffling sounds chasing them through the camp. They didn't stop until they reached their vehicle, the engine roaring to life as they sped away. As they drove, Emily looked back at the camp. In the moonlight, she saw figures standing in the barracks doorways, their eyes glowing faintly. They watched in silence as the researchers disappeared into the night. Days later, the team returned with reinforcements, but the camp was empty. The barracks were still pristine, the beds made, the uniforms untouched. Of Mike, there was no trace. only a new message scrawled on the wall of the command building. "We are still here." The abandoned military base was a maze of decaying buildings and overgrown pathways. Emily, Jack, Mike and Sarah had been exploring the site for hours, documenting every discovery. The air inside the camp was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Sarah uneasy. The base looked like it had been deserted in a hurry, yet something about it felt deliberate, as if its secrets had been buried beneath layers of time and silence. They found the command center near the heart of the camp, its reinforced steel door still intact. Jack gripped the handle and gave it a hard pull, the door groaning open to reveal a control room filled with rusted equipment and scattered papers. The walls were lined with old maps, and the faint smell of mildew permeated the air. "This is where they ran the show," Jack said, stepping inside. His flashlight beam swept across dusty desks and broken monitors. Emily picked up a stack of faded documents from the floor, the pages brittle under her fingers. The top sheet was stamped with a red seal. "Priority orders, command only." The message beneath sent a chill down her spine. "Secure convoy. Cargo is priority. Do not engage unless ordered." "What convoy?" she murmured. "Look at this," Mike said, pointing to a large map tacked to the wall. It was marked with red circles, all converging on the base. Beside the map was a bulletin board covered with photographs. The images were grainy, showing trucks carrying massive covered containers. Soldiers surrounded the convoy in each photo, their expressions grim. "Whatever they were transporting, it wasn't normal," Sarah said, studying the photos. "And they didn't want anyone to know." Emily found more notes scattered across a nearby desk. The handwriting became more frantic as the dates progressed. "Containment protocol failing. Convoy breached. Awaiting further orders." "Breached," Emily said aloud. "By what?" Jack turned toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the room. With a grunt, he forced it open, revealing a stack of folders marked "Confidential." Inside were reports detailing an incident during the convoy's final stop at the base. One line stood out. "Subject Theta neutralized 4 personnel before being secured. Potential biological hazard." Before they could digest the implications, a sudden noise outside the command center made them freeze. It was faint, like the sound of metal scraping against metal. Jack motioned for everyone to stay quiet as he stepped to the doorway, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty corridors and swaying trees. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. They returned to their findings, tension mounting with every new discovery. Emily uncovered an audio recorder, buried beneath a pile of papers. She pressed play, and the room filled with the raspy voice of the camp's commander. "This is Commander Harris. The convoy has arrived, but containment is problematic. The cargo is unstable. 3 men are already dead, and the others are showing signs of exposure. HQ hasn't responded to my calls. If anyone finds this, we didn't fail. They failed us." The recording ended abruptly, the silence that followed unnerving. "What cargo?" Sarah whispered. "What were they transporting?" The answer came in the form of a loud crash from outside. The team jumped to their feet, adrenaline surging. Jack grabbed a crowbar, his jaw set. "Stay here," he ordered. Emily followed him despite his protests, her flashlight shaking in her hand. They stepped into the corridor, the air colder than before. The crash had come from a storage building nearby, its doors slightly ajar. Jack pushed them open, revealing rows of empty crates stacked haphazardly. Each crate was marked with biohazard symbols, and the same red seal they'd seen on the documents. "Whatever was in here is gone," Emily said, her voice trembling. A low growl echoed from the shadows, freezing them in place. Jack swung his flashlight toward the sound, revealing a figure crouched behind the crates. It moved slowly, its hunched frame dragging across the floor. At first glance it looked human, but its elongated limbs and glistening skin betrayed something else entirely. "Run!" Jack whispered, grabbing Emily's arm. They bolted back to the command center, slamming the door behind them. "It's still here," Jack gasped. "Whatever they were transporting, it's still here." "What are you talking about?" Mike asked, panic rising in his voice. Before Jack could answer, the door buckled under the weight of something slamming against it. The growls grew louder, joined by the screech of claws against metal. "Block it!" Jack shouted, shoving a desk against the door. The group scrambled to barricade the entrance, but the sound of the creature's relentless assault filled the room. Emily's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information they had uncovered. "The soldiers weren't protecting the cargo," she said. "They were protecting us from it." The growls stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. The team held their breath, the tension unbearable. Then the sound of shattering glass rang out, and the creature was inside, its glowing eyes fixed on them. The base had been unsettling from the start, but it was the hatch near the centre of the camp that truly unnerved the team. Emily, Jack, Mike and Sarah stared at the heavy steel door embedded in the ground. Its edges were rusted, but the bolts holding it shut looked newer than anything else around. "Doesn't fit the timeline," Jack muttered, running his hand over the reinforced surface. This hatch was maintained long after the rest of the camp was abandoned. Emily knelt to examine the faded stencil on the hatch. Facility X-13. "What do you think's down there?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "Only one way to find out," Mike replied, hefting a crowbar. The hatch groaned as Mike forced it open, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. A metal ladder disappeared into darkness below. Jack was the first to descend, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The others followed, their boots echoing on the rungs. At the bottom, they found a narrow corridor lined with peeling paint and corroded pipes. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, sharp and acrid. Emergency lights flickered weakly along the ceiling, casting shadows that danced unnervingly on the walls. "This place is massive," Emily whispered as they moved deeper. The corridor opened into a series of rooms filled with rusting equipment and shattered glass. The remnants of large tanks stood against one wall, their thick glass panes cracked and clouded. Each tank had a label etched into the steel base: Subject A1. Subject B3. Sarah pointed to a row of cages in the corner, their bars bent and warped. Whatever was in here, it got out. Emily shuddered, stepping closer to a table littered with medical instruments. A dusty clipboard lay among the debris, its pages brittle but legible. She skimmed the text, her stomach twisting. Project Genesis, Phase 3. Objective: enhance biological resilience through mutagenic exposure. Initial tests yielded promising results. Subjects exhibit increased strength and sensory capabilities. Side effects: instability, aggression. Mutagenic exposure, Mike said, reading over her shoulder. They were experimenting on people. And it didn't go well, Jack added, shining his flashlight on a dark stain that stretched across the floor. This isn't old blood. The Geiger counter on Emily's belt began clicking softly, its rhythm accelerating as they moved toward a sealed door at the far end of the room. A keypad blinked faintly beside it, its display cracked but functional. Jack punched a few buttons at random, and to their surprise the door hissed open. "Maybe we shouldn't," Sarah began, but Jack had already stepped inside. The room beyond was colder, the walls lined with monitors and file cabinets. At its centre was a steel table, surrounded by surgical lights. Shackles hung from its edges, and the surface was stained with rust, or something darker. On the far wall, a large viewing window looked into another chamber. The glass was cracked, but through it, they could make out a shadowy figure slumped in the corner. Jack approached the intercom below the window. "What is that?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silent room. The figure twitched. "Step back," Emily warned, grabbing his arm. The shadow in the chamber moved again, faster this time. It rose to its feet, its movements jerky and unnatural. As the flashlight beams caught it, they saw its full form, a humanoid figure with elongated limbs, its skin translucent and stretched tight over corded muscle. Its eyes were bulbous and black, reflecting the light like twin mirrors. The creature lunged at the glass, slamming into it with a force that rattled the walls. Sarah screamed, stumbling back. "It's alive," Mike breathed, his voice barely audible. Emily found a stack of tapes on a nearby console, She inserted one into the player, and the room filled with the voice of a frantic scientist. Subject Theta is unstable. The enhancements have progressed beyond control. It recognizes us. It remembers. We've sealed it in the containment chamber, but the glass won't hold forever. If anyone finds this... The recording cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Another crash reverberated through the room as the creature struck the glass again, a web of cracks spidering across its surface. The Geiger counter clicked wildly, its sound merging with the creature's guttural growls. "We have to leave," Emily said, backing toward the door. As they turned to flee, the lights flickered and went out. The only illumination came from their flashlights, their beams shaking as the team scrambled down the corridor. Behind them, the sound of shattering glass echoed, followed by heavy, uneven footsteps. "It's out!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. The team raced back toward the ladder, the creature's growls growing louder with every step. Sarah climbed first, her hands slipping on the cold metal. Emily was next, her heart pounding as she felt the vibrations of the creature's pursuit. Jack and Mike reached the ladder last, but the creature was too close. It lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Mike screamed as it caught his leg, dragging him back into the darkness. "Mike!" Emily yelled, but Jack pulled her up, his face pale. They sealed the hatch behind them, collapsing on the ground as the silence of the forest enveloped them. The base below seemed quiet again, but they knew better. Days later, the team returned with reinforcements, but the lab was empty. The shattered containment chamber stood as a silent testament to what they had unleashed. A single message was etched into the steel wall of the lab. It remembers. The towering radio mast was the first thing the team saw as they approached the abandoned military base. Rising above the decaying buildings, it seemed almost intact despite years of neglect. Emily, Jack, Sarah and Mike paused near its base, staring up at its skeletal frame. "Still standing," Emily muttered, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Not just standing," Mike added, holding up his receiver. "It's broadcasting." "What?" Sarah asked, her tone sharp. "There's no power here." "Then explain this." Mike turned a dial, and faint static gave way to a distorted voice. "Evacuation. Containment breached. Return to protocol." "It's a recording," Jack said, "on a loop." The team exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's see where it's coming from," Emily said, gesturing toward a small shack at the tower's base. The door creaked as Jack pushed it open. Inside, they found rusting equipment and a control panel. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of burning wires. The Geiger counter Emily carried began a soft but steady clicking. Mike approached the console, scanning its dials and switches. "This shouldn't be running," he said, tapping a glowing indicator light. "No power grid, no generator. How is this thing broadcasting?" Sarah picked up a stack of logs from a nearby desk. The pages were filled with coordinates and hastily scrawled notes. Interference increasing. Unknown signal detected. Personnel missing. Cause unconfirmed. "What were they tracking?" Sarah murmured. Emily flipped through another logbook, her brow furrowing. "These dates are from 20 years ago," she said. "But the last entry, it's just 2 months old." Before they could process the implications, the recording looped again. This time the voice was louder, clearer. "Do not leave the signal. They are listening." A chill ran through the room. "Who's they?" Sarah asked. "We'll find out soon," Jack said, pointing to a ladder near the shack's rear. It led to an underground hatch, partially concealed by overgrown vines. "We're really going down there?" Mike asked, hesitating. Jack smirked. "Why not? It's what we're here for." The ladder descended into darkness, the air growing colder as they climbed. At the bottom, the team found a corridor lined with flickering emergency lights. The walls were reinforced with steel, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the space. "This place looks operational," Emily whispered. Why wasn't it on the base's layout? The corridor opened into a monitoring station filled with outdated equipment. Screens lined the walls, most cracked or dark, but one still flickered faintly. The image showed a static-filled view of the surrounding forest, the camera slowly panning as though searching for something. Emily approached the screen, her breath catching when she noticed movement in the corner of the frame. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast to identify. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. Before Emily could answer, the image flickered, and the screen went black. A loud hiss erupted from a nearby speaker, followed by a distorted voice. "We are here!" The lights in the room flickered, casting the shadows into disarray. The Geiger counter clicked frantically, its rhythm escalating with every second. "Let's leave," Sarah urged, backing toward the door. Jack ignored her, his flashlight illuminating a sealed door labelled Containment Chamber. A keypad beside it blinked faintly, its green light out of place in the otherwise decaying facility. "Jack, don't—" Emily began, but it was too late. He punched a few buttons, and the door hissed open. The room beyond was cold, its walls lined with viewing windows. Inside each windowless chamber was a chair fitted with restraints. A clipboard on the nearest console read, "Test subjects, audio sensitivity enhancement, side effects, paranoia, violent behavior." Before Emily could process the words, a loud crash echoed from the corridor. The team froze, their flashlights darting toward the sound. The growl that followed was guttural, almost human. "We need to go," Emily said, gripping Sarah's arm. Jack hesitated, his eyes fixed on a faint shadow moving at the far end of the hallway. "It's just an animal," he muttered, stepping closer. The shadow shifted, rising to its full height. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky. The creature's eyes glinted in the dim light, black and reflective. "Run!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking. The team bolted back toward the ladder, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Behind them, the creature gave chase, its growls reverberating off the steel walls. Emily climbed first, her hands trembling as she scrambled to the surface. Sarah and Mike followed, their breaths ragged. Jack was the last to ascend, but the creature was too close. It lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Jack screamed as it caught his leg, dragging him downward. His flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering before going out. "Jack!" Emily cried, but Sarah pulled her away, slamming the hatch shut. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The radio tower stood silent above them, its once active signal eerily quiet. Emily looked back at the base, her heart heavy. "What did they unleash?" Sarah whispered. Days later, reinforcements arrived to investigate. The hatch was sealed, and the monitoring station was dark. Only one message remained, carved into the steel near the ladder. "We always hear you." The corporate retreat was supposed to be a night of bonding, luxury, and trust-building exercises. At least, that's what the CEO, Richard Weller, had promised his executives. The event was held at an opulent private estate, hidden deep in the countryside. The invitation was clear: arrive promptly at 6 p.m, wear a mask of your choosing, and be prepared for an unforgettable evening. Tensions had been brewing at the company for months. Rumours of backdoor deals, cutthroat betrayals, and embezzlement had soured relationships. But tonight, behind the anonymity of masks, the group was meant to start fresh. The ballroom glimmered with golden light as the executives entered, their masks adding an air of mystery. The theme was decadence, and the tables overflowed with fine wines, exquisite food, and a promise of indulgence. As the employees mingled, laughter mixed with murmurs of unease. No one could entirely shake the tension that had followed them from the boardroom. Richard raised his glass from the head of the long dining table, his silver wolf mask catching the light. "Tonight is about unity," he said, his voice commanding. "We've had our differences, but here in this place, we leave them behind. Enjoy yourselves." As dinner began, the guests relaxed, their laughter growing louder. The wine flowed freely, and the masks gave everyone a sense of freedom. But it wasn't long before the first note was discovered. Tucked beneath a wineglass, the folded paper was addressed to a senior executive, Margaret, who had spent the evening avoiding eye contact with her peers. She read it silently, her face draining of colour. The message was simple. "I know what you did. Margaret excused herself from the table, retreating to the powder room. When she didn't return after several minutes, her assistant went to check on her. Moments later, a scream echoed through the mansion. The group rushed to the scene. Margaret's body was slumped against the marble sink, her mask shattered on the floor. Her throat was slashed, her blood pooling around her. On the mirror, written in red lipstick, were the words, "One down." Panic spread like wildfire. "This has to be a joke," someone muttered, though the terror in their voice betrayed them. Richard's booming voice cut through the chaos. "No one leaves. Security has locked the doors, and we'll get to the bottom of this." His command didn't calm the group. Whispers spread as accusations flew. Margaret had been skimming from the company, one man said. Everyone knew. "Who's next?" someone else hissed, their eyes darting nervously. The second note was found soon after, tucked into the pocket of Michael, the CFO. The words made his heart pound. "You'll pay for your betrayal." He clenched his fists, trying to appear calm, but it was clear the message had rattled him. He left the room quietly, his mask slipping slightly as he glanced over his shoulder. Not long after, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the hall. The group rushed toward the sound, finding Michael hanging from the balcony railing. His mask was missing, and his lifeless body swayed gently. The words, "Greed kills," scrawled on a note pinned to his chest. Richard's mask couldn't hide the rage in his eyes. "Whoever's doing this, stop hiding! Show yourself!" His voice reverberated through the room, but no answer came. Anna, a junior executive, tugged on Richard's arm. "We need to leave. This isn't about unity, it's revenge." Richard glared at her. "You don't know what you're talking about." But she did. The retreat wasn't just about bonding, it was damage control. Richard had invited his most trusted and most threatening employees, the ones who knew his secrets, the ones who could destroy him. Someone in the room was using the anonymity of the masks to settle scores. Another note appeared, this time addressed to Anna. It read, "You've been loyal, but loyalty won't save you." Her hands shook as she showed it to Richard. "We're all targets," she whispered. "Even you." The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Shouts erupted, followed by a crash and the sound of glass shattering. When the lights returned, another body lay in the centre of the room. Timothy, one of Richard's longest-serving allies. His mask was gone, his face frozen in an expression of terror. A knife protruded from his chest, and the note beside him read, "Silence is deadly." The remaining guests huddled together, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting to every shadow. Richard's composure cracked. "We're leaving," he barked. But when they reached the main doors, they found them locked, the keys missing. From the balcony above, a figure emerged, cloaked in black with a simple, featureless mask. They spoke in a calm, measured tone. "The sins of this company run deep. Tonight we clean house." Richard charged forward, but the figure disappeared into the darkness. One by one, the lights began to go out again, the darkness consuming the room. Anna's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall, clutching her mask as if it could protect her. A scream pierced the air, followed by silence. When the lights returned, only Anna and Richard remained. The masked figure stood between them, holding a knife dripping with blood. They tilted their head, their voice echoing through the hall. "Who deserves to live?" The invitation had been clear. "You are cordially invited to an exclusive murder mystery masquerade. Trust no one, solve the game, and win the prize of a lifetime." It came with an ornate mask and instructions to arrive promptly at 7 p.m. The location, an isolated manor on a misty hilltop, added to the allure. 15 guests gathered in the grand hall, their faces obscured by elaborate masks. The room was draped in dark velvet, illuminated only by flickering candelabras. The host, a man in a plain black mask and a tailored suit, stepped forward to address the group. "Welcome to the game," he said in a deep, measured tone. "Tonight, one of you is the killer. Your job is to unmask them before it's too late. Remember, in this game, secrets are your weapon, and trust is your enemy. The room buzzed with excitement as the rules were explained. Clues would be hidden throughout the manor, and the guests could interrogate one another to uncover the killer's identity. But when the host added, "The consequences for failure are dire," an uneasy laugh rippled through the crowd. As the game began, the guests fanned out, searching for clues. Some rifled through bookshelves in the library, others crept through darkened hallways, and a few lingered in the dining room, sipping wine and speculating about the game's twists. The first scream came an hour later. The guests rushed to the parlour, where a man lay sprawled on the floor, a knife protruding from his chest. His mask, a golden lion, was missing. The host appeared suddenly, his dark figure looming over the scene. "It seems the game has truly begun," he said calmly. "Wait," a woman in a feathered mask stammered. "Is this real?" The host tilted his head. "What do you think?" The room erupted into chaos. "This wasn't part of the plan," one man shouted. "We need to leave." But the host gestured to the doors. "You're free to try," he said. The guests scrambled to the entrance, only to find it locked. The windows, too, were barred, and the thick mist outside seemed impenetrable. "What the hell is going on?" someone demanded. The host smiled beneath his mask. "The rules are simple. Solve the mystery, or don't." With no choice but to continue, the group reluctantly returned to the game. Tensions ran high as alliances formed and dissolved. Whispers filled the air as suspicions grew. Some guests accused one another outright, while others feigned ignorance. Then came the second death. A woman in a sapphire mask was found in the study. Her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Another mask had disappeared. Pinned to her dress was a note. "Lies are deadly." The host's voice echoed through the manor. "The killer is among you. Who do you trust?" Panic spread. A man in a fox mask grabbed a candlestick, his hands trembling. "I'm not waiting to be next," he growled, his eyes darting to the others. "Stay away from me." The guests began to fracture, each person retreating into their own corner of the manor. Anna, a quiet woman in a simple silver mask, stayed close to the shadows. She had been watching, listening, piecing together the connections between the victims. The Golden Lion had been an investment banker known for ruthless deals. The sapphire mask belonged to a woman infamous for corporate espionage. Both had enemies, lots of them. The killer wasn't choosing at random. Hours passed, and the deaths continued. Each body was found with their mask missing and a cryptic message left behind. The notes became increasingly personal, referencing sins and betrayals the victims had tried to keep hidden. Anna's heart raced as she realized the killer was using the game to expose secrets. Her own invitation flashed through her mind. She had come out of curiosity, but what if her presence wasn't a coincidence? What if she had been chosen for a reason? The remaining guests gathered in the grand hall, their masks askew and their nerves frayed. Only 5 of them were left. The host appeared once more, his calm demeanour unshaken. "It's time to make your accusations," he said. "Who is the killer?" The group exchanged frantic glances. "It's him," a man shouted, pointing at the host. "This whole thing was his idea." The host chuckled. "How predictable. Do you think the killer would make it so obvious?" Anna stepped forward. "It's none of us," she said, her voice steady. "This game isn't about finding the killer. It's about surviving." The others stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" one asked. "The killer doesn't care about being caught," Anna continued. "They're punishing us. This game is their way of making us suffer for our secrets." A slow clap echoed through the room. The host removed his mask, revealing a face none of them recognized. His eyes glinted with amusement. "Well done," he said. "You've figured it out." "Who are you?" Anna demanded. "Someone who knows the truth about each of you," he replied. "This game was never about winning. It was about justice." Before anyone could react, the lights flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, screams and footsteps echoing through the hall. When the lights returned, the host was gone. Anna stood in the centre of the room, surrounded by empty masks. The others had vanished, leaving her alone in the grand hall. A single note lay at her feet. You were the only innocent one. The doors creaked open, revealing the misty dawn outside. Anna stumbled into the cool air, her mind racing. The manor loomed behind her, silent and still. The game was over, but the memories and the secrets would haunt her forever. The mansion stood at the edge of a cliff, its imposing silhouette outlined against the dark sky. Dozens of luxury cars lined the driveway as elegantly dressed guests stepped out, their masks glinting in the faint moonlight. It was the New Year's Eve masquerade, an annual event hosted by the enigmatic billionaire Elias Vanderhall. Invitations were as rare as they were coveted, promising an unforgettable night of decadence and mystery. Catherine adjusted her intricate silver mask as she walked through the grand entrance. Inside, chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light. Waiters glided past with trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Everything about the scene was perfect, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Catherine couldn't shake. Her invitation had been unexpected. She wasn't wealthy, nor part of the elite social circle. Yet there it was, delivered in an ornate envelope, with her name embossed in gold. As she mingled, she noticed others glancing around nervously, their masks hiding furrowed brows. It wasn't just her. Something was off. The unease deepened when a waiter discreetly handed Catherine a folded note. It was tucked beneath her champagne flute, the handwriting precise but unfamiliar. "You are not safe. Watch your back." Her stomach tightened. She scanned the crowd, but everyone seemed absorbed in their conversations and laughter. Shaking off her nerves, she slipped the note into her clutch and made her way to the edge of the room, where the host stood greeting guests. Elias Vanderhall was magnetic, his sharp features partially obscured by a golden mask. Rumours surrounded him, whispers of failed investments, enemies made in high places, and secrets buried beneath his empire. As Catherine approached, his piercing gaze locked onto her. "Miss Grey," he said smoothly, his voice low. "Enjoying the evening?" "Yes," she lied, the note burning in her mind. "It's quite unique." "Good." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you'll find it memorable." Before she could respond, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and when the lights returned, a shrill scream cut through the music. Near the centre of the ballroom, a man lay on the floor, his mask tightened around his neck like a noose. His face was blue, his eyes wide and lifeless. Panic erupted. Guests backed away, some shouting for help. Catherine's heart raced as she watched Elias step forward, his expression unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his tone calm despite the chaos. "This is unfortunate, but I assure you everything is under control. Please remain where you are." The crowd murmured uneasily, but no one dared to leave. Security guards appeared, sealing the exits. Catherine's pulse quickened. This wasn't an accident. Another waiter approached her, slipping a second note into her hand before vanishing into the crowd. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "You're next." She bolted for the nearest exit, but a guard blocked her path. "No one leaves," he said firmly. She retreated, her mind racing. Who had sent the notes, and why her? The lights flickered again. When they steadied, another scream rang out. This time, a woman in an emerald gown lay slumped against a column, her mask shattered beside her. A pool of blood spread beneath her, a knife protruding from her chest. The panic turned to outright chaos as guests pushed against the locked doors, shouting and pounding for release. Catherine slipped into a side hallway, desperate to escape the crowd. Her heels echoed against the marble floor as she ducked into an empty library. She sank into a chair, trying to steady her breathing. But as the silence settled, she heard faint footsteps approaching. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. A figure stepped into the doorway, their face obscured by a simple black mask. They held a champagne flute, swirling the liquid lazily. "Why are you running?" the figure asked, their voice distorted. "The party's just getting interesting." Catherine bolted to her feet, her back against the wall. "Stay away from me." The figure tilted their head. "But you were invited, Miss Grey. You must be special." "Who are you?" she demanded. The figure laughed softly, stepping closer. Catherine grabbed a heavy book from a nearby shelf and hurled it, but the figure sidestepped easily. "Do you think you were chosen by accident?" they said. "Elias likes his games, but this one is special. He's cleaning house." "What are you talking about?" she whispered. The figure paused, as if considering whether to answer. "You're here because someone wants you gone. He's just the one pulling the strings." Before she could respond, the figure turned and vanished into the shadows. The doors to the library burst open as security guards rushed in, followed by Elias. "Miss Grey," he said, his voice sharp, "you shouldn't be wandering alone." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Was he the killer, or just another pawn in this twisted game? Before she could speak, he extended a hand. "Come with me. You're safe now." But as she looked into his cold eyes, she knew one thing for certain. No one in that mansion was safe. The wedding of Elizabeth and Charles was the social event of the year. Hosted in a secluded countryside estate, the couple spared no expense to ensure their celebration was a night to remember. The invitation explicitly required guests to wear elegant masks for the evening reception, adding an air of mystery to the festivities. Elizabeth loved the idea. It felt timeless, romantic. But as the night wore on, the masks would become symbols of something much darker. The ballroom was breathtaking. Golden chandeliers illuminated rows of tables adorned with fine china and cascading floral arrangements. Guests in extravagant gowns and tailored suits danced beneath the glittering lights. The bride, dressed in white with a delicate lace mask, looked radiant. Charles, her dashing groom, watched her adoringly. As the clock struck midnight, the staff discreetly locked the estate doors. A storm had begun outside, heavy rain battering the windows, making it impossible for anyone to leave. The estate's remote location meant no one questioned the precaution. It seemed sensible to keep the guests safe from the storm. The first sign of trouble came when a server found a blood-stained mask abandoned on the floor. He quickly brought it to the wedding planner, who brushed it off as a prank. But Elizabeth overheard and couldn't shake her unease. Moments later, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by nervous laughter. When the lights returned, the laughter died. At the edge of the dance floor, a man lay on the ground, his body twisted unnaturally. His mask was gone, and his face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the polished wood. Screams erupted as guests scrambled away. Charles ran to the man's side, but it was too late. The storm outside roared louder, the rain hammering against the windows. "Everyone stay calm," Charles shouted, trying to restore order. "It could be an accident." But it wasn't. Minutes later, another guest screamed. A woman was found slumped in her chair, a jagged wound across her throat. Her mask was missing, her face obscured by her long hair. Panic spread like wildfire. Guests pressed against the locked doors, pounding and shouting to be let out, but the staff had vanished. Elizabeth clung to Charles. "What is happening?" she whispered. Charles shook his head, his jaw tight. "We'll get through this." Another cry came from the centre of the room. A note was found tucked under a glass at one of the tables. It read, "Only the worthy deserve to leave." The ballroom descended into chaos. Some guests turned on each other, accusing one another of being the killer. Others huddled in corners, trembling behind their masks. Elizabeth scanned the room, her heart racing. Her wedding, the happiest night of her life, had become a nightmare. A waiter's tray clattered to the ground, drawing everyone's attention. Another body lay sprawled beneath the table, a shattered mask beside them. Carved into the wood above the body were the words, "Another unworthy soul." The killer was in the room, hidden among them, and no one knew who to trust. Charles rallied a small group to search for a way out. They pried open a side door, only to find a long hallway that led to the servants' quarters. The group hesitated, but Charles pressed forward, Elizabeth close behind. The hallway was eerily silent, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls. "Stay close," Charles whispered. At the end of the hall, they found a small control panel with switches labelled for the estate's systems. Charles reached to unlock the doors, but as his hand moved toward the lever, a knife plunged through his chest. He gasped, blood staining his pristine white suit, and collapsed to the floor. Elizabeth screamed, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. Behind her, a masked figure stepped out of the shadows, holding the bloody knife. Their mask was featureless, smooth and reflective, obscuring any hint of identity. "You ruined it," the figure said in a low voice, tilting their head. This was supposed to be perfect. Elizabeth backed away, trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The figure's head tilted again, as if considering the question. "You wouldn't understand. Not yet." Before Elizabeth could respond, the figure disappeared into the darkness. She stumbled back into the ballroom, tears streaming down her face. The remaining guests were huddled together, their whispers frantic. Another body lay on the floor, the killer's mark etched into the victim's mask. Elizabeth realized there was no escape. The storm raged outside, the doors were locked, and the killer moved among them, blending perfectly with the masked crowd. As the night dragged on, the guests dwindled. One by one they were picked off, each body found with their mask missing, replaced by a cryptic message carved into the floor. Elizabeth clutched her torn dress, her mind racing. When dawn finally broke, the storm subsided. The main doors creaked open, sunlight spilling into the devastated ballroom. Elizabeth was the only one left, her dress stained with blood, her mask askew. She stumbled into the daylight, gasping for air. Behind her, the estate loomed in silence. But as she turned back, she saw them, dozens of masks lined up neatly on the steps, each one staring back at her. And at the top of the steps stood the figure, their featureless mask glinting in the morning light. The masquerade ball was the highlight of the year. Hosted in a centuries-old mansion at the heart of the city, it drew the wealthy, the influential, and the curious. Anna had received her invitation unexpectedly. A gilded envelope slipped under her apartment door. She couldn't resist the intrigue. The note promised an evening of elegance, mystery, and anonymity. The ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, their light reflecting off the intricate masks of the guests. The sound of a live orchestra filled the air, and a sea of vibrant gowns and tailored suits moved in time to the music. Anna adjusted her emerald green mask, her heart racing as she stepped further into the room. Then she saw her, the dancer in red. Among the muted golds, silvers, and blacks of the guests, the dancer stood out. Her crimson gown shimmered like fire, and her matching mask hid everything but her piercing eyes. She moved with an almost hypnotic grace, weaving through the crowd like a predator sizing up its prey. The room seemed to part for her, every head turning to watch as she passed. Anna couldn't look away. "Who is that?" she whispered to a man standing nearby. He glanced at the dancer, his expression tightening. "I've no idea, but there's something off." Anna nodded, her unease growing. The dancer's presence was magnetic, but the way she moved, deliberate and calculated, sent a chill down her spine. The orchestra struck up a new tune, and the guests paired off for a waltz. The dancer, now at the centre of the room, began to twirl, her gown a blur of red. She didn't seem to have a partner, but no one dared approach her. The first scream shattered the music. A man collapsed near the edge of the room, clutching his throat. Blood seeped through his crisp white shirt, pooling on the polished floor. Guests screamed and scattered, the waltz forgotten. Anna stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. The man's mask lay shattered beside him, his lifeless eyes staring at nothing. "Everyone stay calm," a voice called out, but the panic had already spread. The orchestra stopped playing, and guards rushed to secure the doors. No one could leave. Anna's eyes darted to the dancer in red. She stood motionless, watching the chaos unfold. Her head tilted slightly, as if amused. Then, without a word, she disappeared into the crowd. Moments later, a second scream rang out. This time, a woman collapsed near the refreshments table, her mask cracked in two. A knife jutted from her back, its silver blade gleaming. The crowd surged toward the exits, but the guards held firm, locking everyone inside. Anna felt a hand on her arm and spun around, ready to scream. It was Mark, an acquaintance she'd spotted earlier in the evening. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," he said, his eyes darting nervously. "But I think it's her, the one in red. The dancer." Mark nodded. "She's been moving through the crowd all night. Every time someone dies, she's nearby." Anna's stomach twisted. "But why?" "I don't know. But we need to stick together." The two of them began moving toward the edge of the room, keeping an eye out for the dancer. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted completely. Guests whispered in frightened tones, clutching their masks as if they could protect them. The once elegant space now felt suffocating, the opulence a cruel contrast to the bloodstains on the floor. Then Anna saw her again. The dancer in red stood at the base of the grand staircase, her head tilted as she surveyed the room. Her eyes locked with Anna's, and a cold smile spread across her lips. She lifted a gloved hand and beckoned. "No," Anna whispered, stepping back. The dancer began to ascend the staircase, her movements impossibly smooth, her gown trailing behind her like spilled wine. "Come on," Mark urged, pulling Anna toward the side door. But as they moved, the lights flickered and dimmed. In the sudden shadows, the sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly close. "Mark," Anna whispered, but he was gone. She turned frantically, her heart pounding as she searched the darkened room. Guests stumbled and shouted, their masks glowing faintly in the dim light. The dancer in red was nowhere to be seen. A hand clamped down on Anna's shoulder. She screamed and spun around, her fist connecting with a solid chest. "Anna, it's me!" Mark hissed, holding up his hands. "Come on, we have to—" His voice cut off as a thin line appeared across his throat. Blood poured out as he collapsed to the ground, his mask falling away. Behind him stood the dancer, her knife glinting in the low light. Anna stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. The dancer tilted her head again, as if savouring the moment, before stepping forward. Anna turned and ran, her heels slipping on the blood-slick floor. She burst through a side door and into the servants' corridor, the muffled sounds of panic fading behind her. She didn't stop running until she reached the outer gardens, her chest heaving. The night was cold and silent, the ballroom a distant glow behind her. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Then she heard the rustle of fabric behind her. Turning slowly, she saw the dancer in red standing beneath an archway, her knife dripping with blood. Her mask glinted in the moonlight, and her voice was barely audible as she spoke. "This dance isn't over,"